Good evening, and welcome to Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's installment provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep for once. So lie back, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath, and off we go. This evening we're returning to an old favorite, The Republic of Plato, translated into English, with introduction, analysis, marginal analysis, and index, by Benjamin Jowett, M.A., Master of Balliol College, Regius Professor of Greek in the University of Oxford, Doctor in Theology of the University of Leyden, in 3 volumes. Oxford, Clarendon Press, 1888. Let's begin where we left off in the introduction and analysis. Leaving the characters, we may now analyze the contents of the Republic, and then proceed to consider 1. The general aspects of this Hellenic ideal of the state, and 2. The modern lights in which the thoughts of Plato may be read. Book 1. The Republic opens with a truly Greek scene, a festival in honor of the goddess Bendis, which is held in the Piraeus. To this is added the promise of an equestrian torch race in the evening. The whole work is supposed to be recited by Socrates on the day after the festival to a small party, consisting of Critias, Timaeus, Hermocrates, and another. This we learn from the first words of the Timaeus. When the rhetorical advantage of reciting the dialogue has been gained, the attention is not distracted by any reference to the audience, nor is the reader further reminded of the extraordinary length of the narrative. Of the numerous company, 3 only take any serious part in the discussion, nor are we informed whether in the evening they went to the torch race, or talked as in the symposium through the night. The manner in which the conversation has arisen is described as follows. Socrates and his companion Glaucon are about to leave the festival when they are detained by a message from Polemarchus, who speedily appears accompanied by Adeimantus, the brother of Glaucon, and with playful violence compels them to remain, promising them not only the torch race, but the pleasure of conversation with the young, which to Socrates is a far greater attraction. They return to the house of Cephalus, Polemarchus's father, now in extreme old age, who is found sitting upon a cushioned seat crowned for a sacrifice. You should come to me oftener, Socrates, for I am too old to go to you, and at my time of life, having lost other pleasures, I care the more for conversation. Socrates asks him what he thinks of age, to which the old man replies that the sorrows and discontents of age are to be attributed to the tempers of men, and that age is a time of peace in which the tyranny of the passions is no longer felt. Yes, replies Socrates, but the world will say, Cephalus, that you are happy in old age because you are rich. And there is something in what they say, Socrates, but not so much as they imagine, as Themistocles replied to the Seriphian, neither you, if you had been an Athenian, nor I, if I had been a Seriphian, would have ever been famous. I might in like manner reply to you, neither a good poor man can be happy in age, nor yet a bad rich man. Socrates remarks that Cephalus appears not to care about riches, a quality which he ascribes to his having inherited, not acquired them, and would like to know what he considers to be the chief advantage of them. Cephalus answers that when you are old, the belief in the world below grows upon you, and then to have done justice and never to have been compelled to do injustice through poverty, and never to have deceived anyone, are felt to be unspeakable blessings. Socrates, who is evidently preparing for an argument, next asks, what is the meaning of the word justice? To tell the truth and to pay your debts? No more than this? or must we admit exceptions? Ought I, for example, to put back into the hands of my friend who has gone mad the sword which I borrowed of him when he was in his right mind? There must be exceptions. And yet, says Polemarchus, the definition which has been given has the authority of Simonides. Here Cephalus retires to look after the sacrifices, and bequeaths, as Socrates facetiously remarks, the possession of the argument to his heir, Polemarchus. The description of old age is finished, and Plato, as his manner is, has touched the keynote of the whole work in asking for the definition of justice, first suggesting the question which Glaucon afterwards pursues respecting external goods, and preparing for the concluding mythus of the world below in the slight allusion of Cephalus. The portrait of the just man is a natural frontispiece or introduction to the long discourse which follows, and may perhaps imply that in all our perplexity about the nature of justice, there is no difficulty in discerning who is a just man. The first explanation has been supported by a saying of Simonides, and now Socrates has a mind to show that the resolution of justice into two unconnected precepts, which have no common principle, fails to satisfy the demands of dialectic. He proceeds, what did Simonides mean by this saying of his? Did he mean that I was to give back arms to a madman? No, not in that case, not if the parties are friends and evil would result. He meant that you were to do what was proper, good to friends and harm to enemies. Every act does something to somebody, and following this analogy, Socrates asks, what is this due and proper thing which justice does, and to whom? He has answered that justice does good to friends and harm to enemies, but in what way good or harm? In making alliances with the one and going to war with the other. Then in time of peace, what is the good of justice? The answer is that justice is of use in contracts, and contracts are money partnerships. Yes, but how in such partnerships is the just man of more use than any other man when you want to have money safely kept and not used? Then justice will be useful when money is useless. And there is another difficulty. Justice, like the art of war or any other art, must be of opposites, good at attack as well as at defense, at stealing as well as at guarding. But then justice is a thief, though a hero notwithstanding, like Autolycus, the Homeric hero, who is excellent above all men in theft and perjury. To such a pass have you and Homer and Simonides brought us, though I do not forget that the thieving must be for the good of friends and the harm of enemies. And still there arises another question. Are friends to be interpreted as real or seeming, enemies as real or seeming? And are our friends to be only the good and our enemies to be the evil? The answer is that we must do good to our seeming and real good friends, and evil to our seeming and real evil enemies. Good to the good, evil to the evil. But ought we to render evil for evil at all, when to do so will only make men more evil? Can justice produce injustice any more than the art of horsemanship can make bad horsemen, or heat produce cold? The final conclusion is that no sage or poet ever said that the just return evil for evil. This was a maxim of some rich and mighty man, Periander, Perdiccas, or Ismenias the Theban. Thus the first stage of aphoristic or unconscious morality is shown to be inadequate to the wants of the age. The authority of the poets is set aside, and through the winding mazes of dialectic we make an approach to the Christian precept of forgiveness of injuries. Similar words are applied by the Persian mystic poet to the divine being when the questioning spirit is stirred within him. If because I do evil thou punishest me by evil, what is the difference between thee and me? In this, both Plato and Khayyam rise above the level of many Christian theologians. The first definition of justice easily passes into the second, for the simple words, to speak the truth and pay your debts, is substituted the more abstract, to do good to your friends and harm to your enemies. Either of these explanations gives a sufficient rule of life for plain men, but they both fall short of the precision of philosophy. We may note in passing the antiquity of casuistry, which not only rises out of the conflict of established principles in particular cases, but also out of the effort to attain them, and is prior as well as posterior to our fundamental notions of morality. The interrogation of moral ideas, the appeal to the authority of Homer, the conclusion that the maxim, do good to your friends and harm to your enemies, being erroneous, could not have been the word of any great man, are all of them very characteristic of the Platonic Socrates. Here Thrasymachus, who has made several attempts to interrupt, but has hitherto been kept in order by the company, takes advantage of a pause and rushes into the arena, beginning like a savage animal with a roar. Socrates, he says, what folly is this? Why do you agree to be vanquished by one another in a pretended argument? He then prohibits all the ordinary definitions of justice, to which Socrates replies that he cannot tell how many 12 is, if he is forbidden to say 2 times 6, or 3 times 4, or 6 times 2, or 4 times 3. At first, Thrasymachus is reluctant to argue, but at length, with a promise of payment on the part of the company and of praise from Socrates, he is induced to open the game. Listen, he says, my answer is that might is right, justice the interest of the stronger. Now praise me. Let me understand you first. Do you mean that because Polydamas the wrestler, who is stronger than we are, finds the eating of beef for his interest, the eating of beef is also for our interest who are not so strong? Thrasymachus is indignant at the illustration, and in pompous words, apparently intended to restore dignity to the argument, he explains his meaning to be that the rulers make laws for their own interests. But suppose, says Socrates, that the ruler or stronger makes a mistake, then the interest of the stronger is not his interest. Thrasymachus is saved from this speedy downfall by his disciplined Cleitophon, who introduces the word thinks. Not the actual interest of the ruler, but what he thinks, or what seems to be his interest, is justice. The contradiction is escaped by the unmeaning evasion, for though his real and apparent interests may differ, what the ruler thinks to be his interest will always remain what he thinks to be his interest. Of course, this was not the original assertion, nor is the new interpretation accepted by Thrasymachus himself. But Socrates is not disposed to quarrel about words if, as he significantly insinuates, his adversary has changed his mind. In what follows, Thrasymachus does in fact withdraw his admission that the ruler may make a mistake, for he affirms that the ruler as a ruler is infallible. Socrates is quite ready to accept the new position, which he equally turns against Thrasymachus by the help of the analogy of the arts. Every art or science has an interest, but this interest is to be distinguished from the accidental interest of the artist, and is only concerned with the good of the things or persons which come under the art. And justice has an interest which is the interest not of the ruler or judge, but of those who come under his sway. Thrasymachus is on the brink of the inevitable conclusion when he makes a bold diversion. "Tell me, Socrates," he says, "have you a nurse?" "What a question! Why do you ask?" "Because if you have, she neglects you and lets you go about driveling, and has not even taught you to know the shepherd from the sheep, for you fancy that shepherds and rulers never think of their own interest, but only of their sheep or subjects, whereas the truth is that they fatten them for their use, sheep and subjects alike. And experience proves that in every relation of life, the just man is the loser and the unjust the gainer, especially where injustice is on the grand scale, which is quite another thing from the petty rogueries of swindlers and burglars and robbers of temples. The language of men proves this, our gracious and blessed tyrant and the like, all which tends to show, 1, that justice is the interest of the stronger, and 2, that injustice is more profitable and also stronger than justice. Thrasymachus, who is better at a speech than at a close argument, having deluged the company with words, has a mind to escape, but the others will not let him go, and Socrates adds a humble but earnest request that he will not desert them at such a crisis of their fate. "And what can I do more for you?" he says. "Would you have me put the words bodily into your souls?" "God forbid," replies Socrates, "but we want you to be consistent in the use of terms, and not to employ physician in an exact sense, and then again shepherd or ruler in an inexact. If the words are strictly taken, the ruler and the shepherd look only to the good of their people or flocks and not to their own, whereas you insist that rulers are solely actuated by love of office." "No doubt about it," replies Thrasymachus. "Then why are they paid? Is not the reason that their interest is not comprehended in their art, and is therefore the concern of another art, the art of pay, which is common to the arts in general, and therefore not identical with any one of them? Nor would any man be a ruler unless he were induced by the hope of reward or the fear of punishment. The reward is money or honor. The punishment is the necessity of being ruled by a man worse than himself. And if a state or church were composed entirely of good men, they would be affected by the last motive only, and there would be as much nolo episcopari as there is at present at the opposite. The satire on existing governments is heightened by the simple and apparently incidental manner in which the last remark is introduced. There is a similar irony in the argument that the governors of mankind do not like being in office, and that therefore they demand pay. Enough of this. The other assertion of Thrasymachus is far more important, that the unjust life is more gainful than the just. Now, as you and I, Glaucon, are not convinced by him, we must reply to him. But if we try to compare their respective gains, we shall want a judge to decide for us. We had better therefore proceed by making mutual admissions of the truth to one another. Thrasymachus has asserted that perfect injustice was more gainful than perfect justice, and after a little hesitation he is induced by Socrates to admit the still greater paradox, that injustice is virtue and justice vice. Socrates praises his frankness, and assumes the attitude of one whose only wish is to understand the meaning of his opponents. At the same time, he is weaving a net in which Thrasymachus is finely enclosed. The admission is elicited from him that the just man seeks to gain an advantage over the unjust only, but not over the just, while the unjust would gain an advantage over either. Socrates, in order to test his statement, employs once more the favorite analogy of the arts. The musician, doctor, skilled artist of any sort does not seek to gain more than the skilled, but only more than the unskilled. That is to say, he works up to a rule, standard, law, and does not exceed it, whereas the unskilled makes random efforts at excess. Thus the skilled falls on the side of the good, and the unskilled on the side of the evil, and the just is the skilled, and the unjust is the unskilled. There was great difficulty in bringing Thrasymachus to this point. The day was hot, and he was streaming with perspiration, and for the first time in his life he was seen to blush. But his other thesis that injustice was stronger than justice has not yet been refuted, and Socrates now proceeds to the consideration of this, which, with the assistance of Thrasymachus, he hopes to clear up. The latter is at first churlish, but in the judicious hands of Socrates is soon restored to good humor. Is there not honor among thieves? Is not the strength of injustice only a remnant of justice? Is not absolute injustice absolute weakness also? A house that is divided against itself cannot stand. Two men who quarrel detract from one another's strength, and he who is at war with himself is the enemy of himself and the gods. Not wickedness, therefore, but semi-wickedness flourishes in states. A remnant of good is needed in order to make union in action possible. There is no kingdom of evil in this world. Another question has not been answered. Is the just or the unjust the happier? To this we reply that every art has an end and an excellence or virtue by which the end is accomplished. And is not the end of the soul happiness, and justice the excellence of the soul by which happiness is attained? Justice and happiness being thus shown to be inseparable, the question whether the just or the unjust is the happier has disappeared. Thrasymachus replies, "Let this be your entertainment, Socrates, at the festival of Bendis." Yes, and a very good entertainment with which your kindness has supplied me, now that you have left off scolding. And yet, not a good entertainment, but that was my own fault, for I tasted of too many things. First of all, the nature of justice was the subject of our inquiry, and then whether justice is virtue and wisdom or evil and folly, and then the comparative advantages of just and unjust, and the sum of all is that I know not what justice is. How then shall I know whether the just is happy or not? Thus the sophistical fabric has been demolished, chiefly by appealing to the analogy of the arts. Justice is like the arts, 1. In having no external interest, 2. In not aiming at excess, and 3. Justice is to happiness what the implement of the workman is to his work. At this the modern reader is apt to stumble, because he forgets that Plato is writing in an age when the arts and the virtues, like the moral and intellectual faculties, were still undistinguished. Among early inquirers into the nature of human action, the arts helped to fill up the void of speculation, and at first the comparison of the arts and the virtues was not perceived by them to be fallacious. They only saw the points of agreement in them and not the points of difference. Virtue, like art, must take means to an end. Good manners are both an art and a virtue. Character is naturally described under the image of a statue, and there are many other figures of speech which are readily transferred from art to morals. The next generation cleared up these perplexities, or at least supplied after ages with a further analysis of them. the contemporaries of Plato were in a state of transition and had not yet fully realized the common sense distinction of Aristotle, that virtue is concerned with action, art with production, or that virtue implies intention and constancy of purpose, whereas art requires knowledge only. And yet, in the absurdities which follow from some uses of the analogy, there seems to be an intimation conveyed that virtue is more than art. This is implied in the reductio ad absurdum that Justus is a thief, and in the dissatisfaction which Socrates expresses at the final result. The expression, an art of pay, which is described as common to all the arts, is not in accordance with the ordinary use of language, nor is it employed elsewhere either by Plato or by any other Greek writer. It is suggested by the argument and seems to extend the conception of art to doing as well as making. Another flaw or inaccuracy of language may be noted in the words, "Men who are injured are made more unjust." For those who are injured are not necessarily made worse, but only harmed or ill-treated. The second of the three arguments, that the just does not aim at excess, has a real meaning, though wrapped up in an enigmatical form. That the good is of the nature of the finite is a peculiarly Hellenic sentiment, which may be compared with the language of those modern writers who speak of virtue as fitness, and of freedom as obedience to law. The mathematical or logical notion of limit easily passes into an ethical one, and even finds a mythological expression in the conception of envy. Ideas of measure, equality, order, unity, proportion still linger in the writings of moralists, and the true spirit of the fine arts is better conveyed by such terms than by superlatives. The harmony of the soul and body, and of the parts of the soul with one another, a harmony fairer than that of musical notes, is the true Hellenic mode of conceiving the perfection of human nature. In what may be called the epilogue of the discussion with Thrasymachus, Plato argues that evil is not a principle of strength, but of discord and dissolution, just touching the question which has been often treated in modern times by theologians and philosophers of the negative nature of evil. In the last argument, we trace the germ of the Aristotelian doctrine of an end and a virtue directed towards the end, which again is suggested by the arts. The final reconcilement of justice and happiness and the identity of the individual and the state are also intimated. Socrates reassumes the character of a know-nothing. At the same time, he appears to be not wholly satisfied with the manner in which the argument has been conducted. Nothing is concluded, but the tendency of the dialectical process, here as always, is to enlarge our conception of ideas and to widen their application to human life. Book 2. Thrasymachus is pacified, but the intrepid Glaucon insists on continuing the argument. He is not satisfied with the indirect manner in which, at the end of the last book, Socrates had disposed of the question whether the just or the unjust is the happier. He begins by dividing goods into three classes. First, goods desirable in themselves. Secondly, goods desirable in themselves and for their results. Thirdly, goods desirable for their results only. He then asks Socrates in which of the three classes he would place justice. In the second class, replies Socrates, among goods desirable for themselves and also for their results. Then the world in general are of another mind, for they say that justice belongs to the troublesome class of goods which are desirable for their results only. Socrates answers that this is the doctrine of Thrasymachus, which he rejects. Glaucon thinks that Thrasymachus was too ready to listen to the voice of the charmer, and proposes to consider the nature of justice and injustice in themselves, and apart from the results and rewards of them which the world is always dinning in his ears. He will first of all speak of the nature and origin of justice, secondly of the manner in which men view justice as a necessity and not a good, and thirdly he will prove the reasonableness of this view. To do injustice is said to be a good, to suffer injustice an evil. As the evil is discovered by experience to be greater than the good, the sufferers, who cannot also be doers, make a compact that they will have neither, and this compact or mean is called justice, but is really the impossibility of doing injustice. No one would observe such a compact if he were not obliged. Let us suppose that the just and unjust have two rings, like that of Gyges in the well-known story, which make them invisible, and then no difference will appear in them, for every one will do evil if he can, and he who abstains will be regarded by the world as a fool for his pains. Men may praise him in public out of fear for themselves, but they will laugh at him in their hearts. And now let us frame an ideal of the just and unjust. Imagine the unjust man to be master of his craft, seldom making mistakes and easily correcting them, having gifts of money, speech, strength, the greatest villain bearing the highest character. And at his side let us place the just in his nobleness and simplicity, being, not seeming, without name or reward, clothed in his justice only, the best of men who is thought to be the worst, and let him die as he has lived. I might add, but I would rather put the rest into the mouths of the panegyrists of injustice. They will tell you that the just man will be scourged, racked, bound, will have his eyes put out, and will at last be crucified, literally impaled, and all this because he ought to have preferred seeming to being. How different is the case of the unjust who clings to appearance as the true reality. His high character makes him a ruler. He can marry where he likes, trade where he likes, help his friends and hurt his enemies. Having got rich by dishonesty, he can worship the gods better, and will therefore be more loved by them than the just. I was thinking what to answer when Adeimantus joined in the already unequal fray. He considered that the most important point of all had been omitted. Men are taught to be just for the sake of rewards. Parents and guardians make reputation the incentive to virtue, and other advantages are promised by them of a more solid kind, such as wealthy marriages and high offices. There are the pictures in Homer and Hesiod of fat sheep and heavy fleeces, rich cornfields and trees toppling with fruit, which the gods provide in this life for the just. And the Orphic poets add a similar picture of another. The heroes of Musaeus and Eumolpus lie on couches at a festival with garlands on their heads, enjoying as the meed of virtue a paradise of immortal drunkenness. Some go further and speak of a fair posterity in the third and fourth generation, but the wicked they bury in a slough and make them carry water in a sieve, and in this life they attribute to them the infamy which Glaucon was assuming to be the lot of the just, who are supposed to be unjust. Take another kind of argument, which is found both in poetry and prose. Virtue, as Hesiod says, is honorable but difficult. Vice is easy and profitable. You may often see the wicked in great prosperity and the righteous afflicted by the will of heaven, and mendicant prophets knock at rich men's doors, promising to atone for the sins of themselves or their fathers in an easy fashion with sacrifices and festive games. or with charms and invocations to get rid of an enemy good or bad by divine help and at a small charge. They appeal to books professing to be written by Musaeus and Orpheus, and carry away the minds of whole cities, and promise to get souls out of purgatory. And if we refuse to listen to them, no one knows what will happen to us. When a lively-minded, ingenuous youth hears all this, what will be his conclusion? Will he, in the language of Pindar, make justice his high tower, or fortify himself with crooked deceit? Justice, he reflects, without the appearance of justice, is misery and ruin. Injustice has the promise of a glorious life. Appearance is master of truth and lord of happiness. To appearance then I will turn. I will put on the show of virtue and trail behind me the fox of Archilochus. I hear someone saying that wickedness is not easily concealed, to which I reply that nothing great is easy. Union and force and rhetoric will do much, and if men say that they cannot prevail over the gods, still how do we know that there are gods? Only from the poets, who acknowledge that they may be appeased by sacrifices. Then why not sin and pay for indulgences out of your sin? For if the righteous are only unpunished, still they have no further reward, while the wicked may be unpunished and have the pleasure of sinning too. But what of the world below? Nay, says the argument, there are atoning powers who will set that matter right, as the poets who are the sons of the gods tell us. And this is confirmed by the authority of the state. How can we resist such arguments in favor of injustice? Add good manners, and, as the wise tell us, we shall make the best of both worlds. Who that is not a miserable caitiff will refrain from smiling at the praises of justice? Even if a man knows the better part, he will not be angry with others, for he knows also that more than human virtue is needed to save a man, and that he only praises justice who is incapable of injustice. The origin of the evil is that all men from the beginning, heroes, poets, instructors of youth, have always asserted the temporal dispensation, the honors and profits of justice. Had we been taught in early youth the power of justice and injustice inherent in the soul, and unseen by any human or divine eye, we should not have needed others to be our guardians, but every one would have been the guardian of himself. This is what I want to show you, Socrates. Other men use arguments which rather tend to strengthen the position of Thrasymachus, that might is right, but from you I expect better things. And please, as Glaucon said, to exclude reputation, let the just be thought unjust and the unjust just. And do you still prove to us the superiority of justice? The thesis, which for the sake of argument has been maintained by Glaucon, is the converse of that of Thrasymachus. Not right is the interest of the stronger, but right is the necessity of the weaker. Starting from the same premises, he carries the analysis of society a step further back. Might is still right, but the might is the weakness of the many combined against the strength of the few. There have been theories in modern as well as in ancient times which have a family likeness to the speculations of Glaucon, e.g., that power is the foundation of right, or that a monarch has a divine right to govern well or ill, or that virtue is self-love or the love of power, or that war is the natural state of man, or that private vices are public benefits. All such theories have a kind of plausibility from their partial agreement with experience, for human nature oscillates between good and evil, and the motives of actions and the origin of institutions may be explained to a certain extent on either hypothesis. according to the character or point of view of a particular thinker. The obligation of maintaining authority under all circumstances, and sometimes by rather questionable means, is felt strongly, and has become a sort of instinct among civilized men. The divine right of kings, or more generally of governments, is one of the forms under which this natural feeling is expressed. Nor again is there any evil which has not some accompaniment of good or pleasure, nor any good which is free from some alloy of evil, nor any noble or generous thought which may not be attended by a shadow or the ghost of a shadow of self-interest or of self-love. We know that all human actions are imperfect, but we do not therefore attribute them to the worse rather than to the better motive or principle. Such a philosophy is both foolish and false, like that opinion of the clever rogue who assumes all other men to be like himself. And theories of this sort do not represent the real nature of the state, which is based on a vague sense of right, gradually corrected and enlarged by custom and law, although capable also of perversion, any more than they describe the origin of society, which is to be sought in the family and in the social and religious feelings of man. Nor do they represent the average character of individuals, which cannot be explained simply on a theory of evil, but has always a counteracting element of good. And as men become better, such theories appear more and more untruthful to them, because they are more conscious of their own disinterestedness. A little experience may make a man a cynic. A great deal will bring him back to a truer and kindlier view of the mixed nature of himself and his fellow men. The two brothers ask Socrates to prove to them that the just is happy when they have taken from him all that in which happiness is ordinarily supposed to consist. Not that there is any absurdity in the attempt to frame a notion of justice apart from circumstances, for the ideal must always be a paradox when compared with the ordinary conditions of human life. Neither the Stoical ideal nor the Christian ideal is true as a fact, but they may serve as a basis of education and may exercise an ennobling influence. An ideal is none the worse because someone has made the discovery that no such ideal was ever realized. And in a few exceptional individuals who are raised above the ordinary level of humanity, the ideal of happiness may be realized in death and misery. This may be the state which the reason deliberately approves, and which the utilitarian, as well as every other moralist, may be bound in certain cases to prefer. Nor again must we forget that Plato, though he agrees generally with the view implied in the argument of the two brothers, is not expressing his own final conclusion, but rather seeking to dramatize one of the aspects of ethical truth. He is developing his idea gradually in a series of positions or situations. He is exhibiting Socrates for the first time undergoing the Socratic interrogation. Lastly, the word happiness involves some degree of confusion because associated in the language of modern philosophy with conscious pleasure or satisfaction, which was not equally present to his mind. Glaucon has been drawing a picture of the misery of the just and the happiness of the unjust, to which the misery of the tyrant in Book 9 is the answer and parallel. And still the unjust must appear just, that is, the homage which vice pays to virtue. But now Adeimantus, taking up the hint which had already been given by Glaucon, proceeds to show that in the opinion of mankind, justice is rewarded only for the sake of rewards and reputation, and points out the advantage which is given to such arguments as those of Thrasymachus and Glaucon by the conventional morality of mankind. He seems to feel the difficulty of justifying the ways of God to man. Both the brothers touch upon the question whether the morality of actions is determined by their consequences, and both of them go beyond the position of Socrates, that justice belongs to the class of goods not desirable for themselves only, but desirable for themselves and for their results to which he recalls them. In their attempt to view justice as an internal principle, and in their condemnation of the poets, they anticipate him. The common life of Greece is not enough for them. They must penetrate deeper into the nature of things. It has been objected that justice is honesty in the sense of Glaucon and Adeimantus, but is taken by Socrates to mean all virtue. May we not more truly say that the old-fashioned notion of justice is enlarged by Socrates, and becomes equivalent to universal order or well-being, first in the state and secondly in the individual? He has found a new answer to his old question, whether the virtues are one or many, viz., that one is the ordering principle of the three others. In seeking to establish the purely internal nature of justice, he is met by the fact that man is a social being, and he tries to harmonize the two opposite theses as well as he can. There is no more inconsistency in this than was inevitable in his age and country. There is no use in turning upon him the cross lights of modern philosophy, which, from some other point of view, would appear equally inconsistent. Plato does not give the final solution of philosophical questions for us, nor can he be judged of by our standard. The remainder of the Republic is developed out of the question of the sons of Ariston. 3 points are deserving of remark in what immediately follows. First, that the answer of Socrates is altogether indirect. He does not say that happiness consists in the contemplation of the idea of justice, and still less will he be tempted to affirm the Stoical paradox that the just man can be happy on the rack. But first he dwells on the difficulty of the problem, and insists on restoring man to his natural condition before he will answer the question at all. He too will frame an ideal, but his ideal comprehends not only abstract justice, but the whole relations of man. Under the fanciful illustration of the large letters, he implies that he will only look for justice in society, and that from the state he will proceed to the individual. His answer in substance amounts to this, that under favorable conditions, i.e., in the perfect state, justice and happiness will coincide, and that when justice has been once found, happiness may be left to take care of itself. That he falls into some degree of inconsistency when in the 10th book he claims to have got rid of the rewards and honors of justice may be admitted, for he has left those which exist in the perfect state, and the philosopher who retires under the shelter of a wall can hardly have been esteemed happy by him, at least not in this world. Still, he maintains the true attitude of moral action. Let a man do his duty first, without asking whether he will be happy or not, and happiness will be the inseparable accident which attends him. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Secondly, it may be remarked that Plato preserves the genuine character of Greek thought in beginning with the state and in going on to the individual. First ethics, then politics. This is the order of ideas to us. The reverse is the order of history. Only after many struggles of thought does the individual assert his right as a moral being. In early ages he is not one, but one of many, the citizen of a state which is prior to him, and he has no notion of good or evil apart from the law of his country or the creed of his church, and to this type he is constantly tending to revert, whenever the influence of custom or of party spirit or the recollection of the past becomes too strong for him. Thirdly, we may observe the confusion or identification of the individual and the state, of ethics and politics which pervades early Greek speculation and even in modern times retains a certain degree of influence. The subtle difference between the collective and individual action of mankind seems to have escaped early thinkers, and we too are sometimes in danger of forgetting the conditions of united human action whenever we either elevate politics into ethics or lower ethics to the standard of politics. The good man and the good citizen only coincide in the perfect state, and this perfection cannot be attained by legislation acting upon them from without, but, if at all, by education fashioning them from within. Socrates praises the sons of Ariston, inspired offspring of the renowned hero, as the elegiac poet terms them. But he does not understand how they can argue so eloquently on behalf of injustice, while their character shows that they are uninfluenced by their own arguments. He knows not how to answer them, although he is afraid of deserting justice in the hour of need. He therefore makes a condition that, having weak eyes, he shall be allowed to read the large letters first, and then go on to the smaller. That is, he must look for justice in the state first, and will then proceed to the individual. Accordingly, he begins to construct the state. Society arises out of the wants of man. His first want is food, his second a house, his third a coat. The sense of these needs and the possibility of satisfying them by exchange draw individuals together on the same spot, and this is the beginning of a state which we take the liberty to invent, although necessity is the real inventor. There must be first a husbandman, secondly a builder, thirdly a weaver, to which may be added a cobbler. 4 or 5 citizens at least are required to make a city. Now men have different natures, and one man will do one thing better than many, and business waits for no man. Hence there must be a division of labor into different employments, into wholesale and retail trade, into workers and makers of workmen's tools, into shepherds and husbandmen. A city which includes all this will have far exceeded the limit of 4 or 5, and yet not be very large. But then again, imports will be required, and imports necessitate exports, and this implies variety of produce in order to attract the taste of purchasers, also merchants and ships. In the city, too, we must have a market and money and retail trades. Otherwise, buyers and sellers will never meet, and the valuable time of the producers will be wasted in vain efforts at exchange. If we add hired servants, the state will be complete, and we may guess that somewhere in the intercourse of the citizens with one another, justice and injustice will appear. And that seems as reasonable a spot as any to end this evening's reading. We have a lot more to go, but I'm really enjoying this. If you're still awake, I hope you are too. Before we end, I'd like to thank everyone who supported this podcast on patreon.com. It's much appreciated. Our patron-only episode will be posted this week, and I hope you enjoy it. If you'd like to check out the exclusive perks for subscribers, just go to www.patreon.com/boringbookspod to see what's available. If you'd like to connect, or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, the best place to catch me is on Twitter @boringbookspod. I'd really love to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Until our next boring book, good night.